Some things a man just can't stand by and watch happen. The sound of helpless creatures crying out in terror is one of them. When Boone Mercer rode into Red Hollow that evening, he wasn't looking for trouble. Two men on the old bridge were laughing as they threw a crate full of dogs into the river below. The mother dog and her pups were falling to what seemed like certain death. Without thinking, Boone jumped in after them. He saved every single one. But when those same cruel men went missing days later, folks started remembering who Boone really was. He wasn't just some mountain hermit. He used to be the law in these parts. What made him disappear for all those years, and what brought justice back to Red Hollow? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cold mountain water hit Boone Mercer like a slap from the Almighty himself. But he kept his arms wrapped tight around that wooden crate as the current tried to tear it away. The mother dog, a golden-brown mix with soulful eyes, had stopped her frantic barking the moment he'd grabbed hold. She seemed to understand that this bearded stranger was her family's salvation. 3 pups, no more than 8 weeks old, huddled against their mama's warmth while river water sloshed around their feet. Boone kicked hard for the muddy bank, his boots heavy as anvils, lungs burning from the shock of that October river. When his knees finally hit solid ground, he crawled up through the cattails and cottonwood saplings, never loosening his grip on that crate. "Easy now," he whispered to the trembling dogs as he set them down on dry earth. "You're safe. Nobody's gonna hurt you anymore." The mother dog looked up at him with those amber eyes, and something stirred in Boone's chest that he hadn't felt in years. Trust. Pure, simple trust from a creature that had every reason to fear mankind. He pulled off his wool coat and wrapped it around the shivering family, then glanced up at the bridge where those 2 men had been standing. They were gone. Boone had gotten a good look at them before he jumped, one tall and lean with a black mustache, the other shorter with a red bandana tied around his thick neck. He'd remember their faces. A man didn't forget the look of cruelty, especially when it was directed at something helpless. As the sun dipped behind the canyon walls, Boone gathered dry wood and built a small fire in a clearing sheltered by red rocks. The dogs huddled close to the flames, their breathing gradually steadying. The mother dog, he'd taken to thinking of her as Belle, kept watching him with those intelligent eyes. "You remind me of someone," he told her, scratching behind her ears. "Had a dog once, long time ago. Name was Justice. Finest tracking hound in 3 counties. Justice had been with him during his years as sheriff of Red Hollow, back when the badge on his chest meant something, when people looked to him to keep the peace. That was before the war, before everything went to pieces, before he'd failed the one person who'd counted on him most." Boone reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a piece of jerky, tearing it into small portions for the pups. As they ate hungrily, he found himself thinking about the town he'd left behind 15 years ago. Red Hollow had been growing then, with the railroad bringing new settlers and new problems. Cattle rustlers, claim jumpers, men who thought their guns made them kings. He'd been good at his job, maybe too good. The firelight danced across Belle's face as she settled down with her pups, finally relaxing enough to close her eyes. Boone pulled his knees up to his chest and stared into the flames, remembering another fire, another night when everything had gone wrong. Sarah's face came to him as clear as if she were sitting across from him now. Dark hair pulled back in a simple bun, green eyes that could see right through his stubborn pride, hands that were gentle with wounded animals and wounded men alike. She'd been the town's only doctor, and the only woman who'd ever made him think about hanging up his guns for good. "You can't save everyone, Boone," she'd told him that last night, her fingers tracing the scar on his jaw where a rustler's bullet had grazed him. "But you keep trying to carry the whole world on your shoulders." She'd been right, as usual. He'd been so focused on being the perfect lawman, the man everyone could count on, that he'd lost sight of what really mattered. When the Comancheros had hit the settlement at Willow Creek, he'd been 50 miles away chasing horse thieves. By the time word reached him, Sarah and 12 other souls were dead. The town had blamed him. Hell, he'd blamed himself, so he'd pinned his badge to the sheriff's desk, saddled his horse, and ridden up into the high country where the air was thin and the only law was survival. For 15 years he'd lived like a ghost, trapping beaver, hunting elk, avoiding all human contact except for the occasional trading post visit for supplies. Until tonight, Belle shifted in her sleep, and one of the pups, a little black and white female, crawled over to rest against Boone's boot. The simple gesture hit him harder than any bullet ever had. When was the last time anything had trusted him that completely? He thought about those 2 men on the bridge, the casual cruelty in their laughter as they dumped helpless animals to die. In his years as a lawman, he'd seen that kind of evil before. Men who hurt things weaker than themselves for the pure pleasure of it. They never stopped with animals. The fire crackled and settled, sending sparks up toward the star-filled sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and Belle's ears perked up even in sleep. Boone reached over and stroked her head. "Don't worry, girl. Nothing's getting past me tonight." As he spoke the words, he realized how long it had been since he'd made that promise to anyone. The mountain years had taught him self-reliance, how to live off the land, how to find peace in solitude. But they'd also taught him how to avoid responsibility, how to run when things got complicated, looking down at this little family that fate had dropped into his path. He felt something stirring that he'd thought was dead. A sense of purpose, a reason to care about more than just his next meal or his next shelter. The shortest pup, a runt with golden fur like his mother, opened his eyes and looked up at Boone. The little fellow's tail gave a tentative wag, as if he understood that this grizzled stranger was now part of their pack. "Well, I'll be," Boone whispered. "You're a tough little fella, aren't you?" He'd always been good with animals. Even as a boy growing up on his father's ranch outside Fort Worth, he'd had a way with horses and cattle that seemed to come naturally. His pa used to say he could gentle a Mustang faster than most men could saddle a mare. Sarah had noticed that about him too. She'd watched him work with wounded animals at her clinic, seen how patient he could be when something needed healing. "You've got gentle hands for a man who lives by the gun," she'd told him once while he helped her set a broken wing on a hawk someone had brought in. "Everything deserves a chance to heal," he'd replied, not knowing then how prophetic those words would prove to be. The fire was burning low now, but Boone didn't want to add more wood and risk the smoke being seen from town. Red Hollow was only 3 miles downstream, and word traveled fast in small communities. If those 2 men started talking about seeing a stranger jump off the bridge after a bunch of dogs, folks might start asking questions. Questions Boone wasn't ready to answer, but as he settled back against his saddle and listened to the soft breathing of 4 sleeping dogs, he wondered if maybe it was time to stop running. These animals needed care, proper shelter, and regular meals. He could provide all that up in his mountain cabin, but winter was coming hard this year. He could smell it in the air, see it in the way the aspens had already turned gold and started dropping their leaves. Dogs weren't meant for the kind of isolation he'd chosen for himself. The thought hit him like a physical blow. For 15 years, he'd convinced himself that isolation was what he deserved, what he needed. But maybe, just maybe, what he really needed was something to care for besides his own wounded pride. Belle opened her eyes and looked at him, and in that moment, Boone Mercer made a decision that would change everything. He wasn't going to disappear back into the mountains like smoke on the wind. Not this time. Those 2 men on the bridge had made a mistake when they chose to hurt innocent creatures in his presence. And Red Hollow was about to remember why folks used to sleep easier when Boone Mercer wore a badge. Dawn broke cold over the canyon, painting the rocks the color of dried blood. Boone woke to Belle nudging his hand with her wet nose, her amber eyes alert and worried. The pups were huddled against their mother, but something had spooked them all. Voices carried on the morning air, harsh, angry voices coming from the direction of Red Hollow. Boone rose quietly, checking his colt out of long habit, then crept toward the sound. Through the cottonwoods, he could see the old bridge where it all started. 3 men stood on it now, and 2 of them were the same ones who'd thrown the dogs into the river. Told you we should have finished the job last night, the tall one with the black mustache was saying. His name, Boone learned from listening, was Clem Briggs. How was I supposed to know some crazy mountain man was going to jump in after a bunch of mutts? The shorter one with the red bandana, Jake Morrison, spat into the water below. Besides, what's the big deal? They're just dogs. The third man was older, well-dressed in a black suit despite the early hour. Silver hair slicked back, gold watch chain glinting in the sunrise. When he spoke, the other two shut up fast. The big deal, Jake, is that those dogs belong to Mary Caldwell, and Mary Caldwell's husband happens to be the territorial judge who's coming to Red Hollow next week to hear our case about the water rights. Boone's blood went cold. Judge Caldwell. He'd heard that name even in his mountain isolation. A fair man, they said, but one who didn't tolerate cruelty of any kind, the man in the suit continued, his voice carrying clearly across the water. Judge Caldwell's been looking for an excuse to rule against us, and if he finds out what you two idiots did to his wife's prize breeding dogs— Now hold on, Mr. Garrison, Clem interrupted. You're the one who told us to get rid of the evidence. Said those dogs could link the poisoned water back to your mining operation. Garrison. Boone knew that name too. Marcus Garrison owned the largest silver mine in the territory, and he wasn't particular about how he got what he wanted. I told you to handle it quietly, Garrison snapped. Not throw them off a bridge in broad daylight where half the town might see. Nobody saw, except that mountain man, Jake said. And he's probably halfway to Canada by now. Mountain folks don't stick around for trouble. Boone's jaw tightened. These men had poisoned the water that killed the judge's dogs, then tried to cover it up by dumping the dying animals like trash. And now they figured some mountain man would just disappear and let them get away with it. They'd figured wrong. We need to find that man, Garrison said, pacing the bridge like a caged wolf. Find him and make sure he doesn't talk to anyone about what he saw. How we gonna do that? Clem asked. Could be anywhere by now. He jumped in after those dogs, didn't he? That means he's either a fool or he's got a conscience. Either way, he's not going far without making sure those animals are safe. Garrison pulled out his pocket watch and checked the time. You two spread the word in town. Tell folks there's a reward for information about a stranger with dogs. $50 to whoever finds him first. $50. That was more money than most folks in Red Hollow saw in 6 months. Boone knew how these things went. Desperation made people do things they'd normally never consider. And when we find him— Jake's hand moved to the gun on his hip. Garrison's smile was cold as winter wind. We'll make him an offer he can't refuse. Join us, or join the dogs at the bottom of the river. The 3 men walked back toward town, their voices fading into the morning mist. Boone stayed hidden until he was sure they were gone, then returned to his camp, where Belle and the pups waited, looking at these innocent animals. He felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. These weren't just dogs anymore. They were evidence of a crime, and the only witnesses to corruption that went deeper than animal cruelty. He knelt beside Belle and examined her more carefully in the daylight. Now that he knew what to look for, he could see the signs. Her gums were pale, her breathing slightly labored. The pups were lethargic, not playful like healthy young dogs should be. Poison, something slow-acting, probably slipped into their water over several days. Garrison's mining operation must have contaminated the water source, and when Judge Caldwell's dogs started showing symptoms, someone had panicked. Boone's hands shook as he stroked Belle's head. Sarah would have known what to do. She'd have had medicines, treatments, ways to help these animals recover. All he had was mountain remedies and stubborn determination. But maybe that would be enough. He broke camp quickly, loading his gear onto his packhorse while keeping one eye on the trail. If Garrison's men were offering $50 for information, it wouldn't take long before every drifter and desperate soul in Red Hollow was out looking for a man with dogs. Belle struggled to her feet, clearly weaker than she'd been the night before. The pups whimpered as they tried to follow their mother, their little legs unsteady. Watching them suffer made something hard and cold settle in Boone's chest. He'd seen this kind of thing before during his sheriff days. Rich men who thought their money put them above the law, who'd hurt anyone or anything that got in their way. Back then, he'd had a badge and the backing of the territorial government. Now he had nothing but his guns and his anger. Maybe that would be enough too. "Come on, girl," he said softly, lifting Belle into his arms. She was heavier than she looked, but she didn't struggle, just rested her head against his shoulder with complete trust. The pups were too weak to walk far, so he fashioned a sling from his spare shirt and carried them close to his chest. They settled against his warmth with tiny sighs that broke his heart. As they made their way upstream, staying in the cover of the cottonwoods, Boone's mind was working like it hadn't in years. Garrison needed these dogs to disappear because they were proof of his crimes. The judge was coming to Red Hollow next week, probably to hear a case about water rights that Garrison's mining operation was clearly violating. If these animals died, there'd be no evidence of the poisoning. Garrison could claim the dogs had simply wandered off or been taken by coyotes. Case closed. But if they lived, if someone could prove they'd been poisoned and connect that poisoning to Garrison's mine, a branch snapped somewhere behind them. Boone froze, listening, but heard only the wind in the trees and the distant sound of the river. Still, the feeling of being watched crawled up his spine like a cold snake. He needed to get these dogs to safety, somewhere Garrison's men couldn't find them. His mountain cabin was too far, especially with sick animals, but there were other options. Old mine shafts, abandoned claims, places a man could disappear if he knew the country well enough. And Boone Mercer knew this country better than anyone. As they climbed higher into the foothills, Belle lifted her head and looked back toward Red Hollow. Her eyes held an intelligence that made Boone's chest tight. She knew they were running from something dangerous. She also knew he was all that stood between her family and the men who'd tried to kill them. The weight of that trust settled on his shoulders like a familiar coat. For 15 years, he'd told himself he was done being responsible for other lives. Done being the man people turned to when trouble came calling, but trouble had found him anyway. And it had come wearing the face of helpless animals and poisoned water and rich men who thought murder was just the cost of doing business. Boone Mercer had tried to stay dead to the world, but the world wasn't done with him yet. The old McKinnon place sat in a fold of hills 3 miles northeast of Red Hollow, abandoned since the fever took the family 5 years back. Boone had helped Sean McKinnon build the cabin and barn with his own hands, back when he still wore a badge and believed in things like community and neighbors helping neighbors. Now, those same hands carried dying dogs through the broken gate and up the overgrown path to shelter. The cabin door hung crooked on rusted hinges, but the walls were solid logs and the roof mostly intact. More importantly, the well was spring-fed and clean. Boone tested it with strips of paper Sarah had taught him to use for detecting minerals. No discoloration, no bitter taste. This water would help flush the poison from the dog's systems, if anything could. Belle whimpered as he set her down on the cabin's wooden floor. The pups barely stirred when he placed them beside their mother, their breathing shallow and rapid. In the dusty light filtering through cracked windows, he could see how much weaker they'd become since morning. Time was running out. Boone gathered dry wood from the collapsed woodshed and built a small fire in the stone hearth. The warmth would help, but what these animals really needed was something to counteract whatever toxin was burning through their blood. He'd seen similar symptoms before, during the war, when desperate Confederate units had poisoned water sources to slow Union advances, activated charcoal. That's what the army doctors had used, mixed with water, and forced down the throats of affected soldiers. The charcoal would bind to toxins and help the body eliminate them. But where could he find such a thing out here? The answer came to him as he stared into the fire. Burned willow bark, ground fine and mixed with clean water. It wasn't exactly charcoal, but it worked on similar principles. Sarah had shown him how to make it for treating poisoned livestock. "Hold on, girl," he whispered to Belle as he headed for the door. "I am going to get you something to help." The nearest willow grove was a 1/4 mile downstream, where Willow Creek had carved a shallow valley through the hills. As Boone gathered bark from young trees, his ears stayed alert for sounds of pursuit. Garrison's $50 reward would have half the territory combing these hills by nightfall. A twig snapped in the brush behind him. Boone's hand moved to his Colt, drawing smoothly from long practice. "That's far enough, friend." An old man emerged from the trees, hands raised but not particularly worried. Grey beard, patched clothes, and eyes that had seen too much of the world's hardness. Boone recognized him. Thomas Byrne, who'd prospected these hills for 30 years and never found more than enough silver to keep his belly full. "Easy there." "Mercer," Thomas said, using Boone's name like it wasn't a secret. "Just came to warn you." "Warn me about what?" "Garrison's got men out looking for you, offering $50 for information, $200 if they bring you in alive." Thomas spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Course, he didn't say anything about bringing you in dead." Boone kept his gun drawn but lowered it slightly. "How'd you know where to find me?" "Been watching you since dawn. Figured you'd head for high ground with those sick animals." Thomas stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Saw what you did on that bridge last night. Took guts, or stupidity, maybe both." Thomas glanced toward the McKinnon cabin. "Those dogs getting worse?" Boone nodded, his jaw tight with frustration. "Poisoned. I'm trying to make something to help them, but I'm no doctor. Lucky for you I am." That stopped Boone cold. "You're what?" Thomas chuckled at his expression. "Veterinary doctor, University of Pennsylvania. Class of 1847, came west to make my fortune and stayed to treat animals for folks who couldn't afford the fancy vets in Denver. But you're a prospector." "Man can be more than one thing." Thomas held up a leather satchel Boone hadn't noticed before. "I've been carrying this for 20 years, just in case. You mind if an old fool takes a look at your patients?" Hope flared in Boone's chest, but caution held it in check. "Why would you help me?" $50 is a lot of money. "Because Garrison killed my stream." Thomas's voice went hard as winter iron. "Poisoned Willow Creek with runoff from his operation. Killed every fish for 5 miles downstream. When I complained to the territorial authorities, my mining claim mysteriously got lost in the paperwork." Boone studied the old man's face, seeing the same anger there that he felt burning in his own chest. "What do you know about the judge coming next week?" "Judge Caldwell's hearing Garrison's petition to expand his mining operation into the watershed. If he gets approval, he'll control water rights for the whole valley." Thomas shouldered his satchel. "Only thing stopping him is proof that his current operation's already causing environmental damage, like poisoning a judge's dogs." "Exactly like that." Thomas started walking toward the cabin. "Question is, can we keep those dogs alive long enough to serve as evidence?" They found Belle lying motionless beside her pups, her breathing so faint that Boone's heart nearly stopped. Thomas knelt beside her and opened his satchel, revealing bottles and instruments that gleamed despite their age. "Arsenic poisoning," he said, after examining her gums and checking her pulse. "Slow acting, probably administered over several days. Meant to look like natural illness. Can you save them?" Thomas was already preparing a syringe with fluid from a small bottle. "Depends how much poison they ingested and how long ago. This is sodium thiosulfate. Neutralizes arsenic if we caught it in time." Boone watched the old doctor work with steady hands, injecting each dog with the antidote before mixing a solution of activated charcoal and clean water. Belle barely responded when he forced the mixture down her throat, but the pups showed slightly more fight. "Now we wait," Thomas said, settling back on his heels. "Either the antidote works or it doesn't. Should know within the hour. And if it doesn't work..." Thomas met his eyes. "Then Garrison wins, and Judge Caldwell rules based on incomplete evidence." They sat in silence beside the dogs, two men bound together by shared purpose and common enemies. Outside, the sun climbed toward midday, and somewhere in the distance, voices called back and forth as Garrison's search parties combed the hills. "They'll find us eventually," Boone said. "Maybe, but there are ways to discourage searchers if you know the country well enough." Thomas smiled grimly. "Amazing how often people get lost in these hills, especially city men, who think $50 makes them woodsmen." Belle's eyes fluttered open, and she lifted her head slightly. One of the pups, the little black and white female, struggled to her feet and took a few wobbly steps. "Well, I'll be damned," Thomas whispered. Looks like we might have ourselves some witnesses after all. Boone felt something loosen in his chest, but he didn't dare hope too much. Getting the dogs healthy was only the first step. Keeping them alive long enough to testify, if dogs could testify, against one of the territory's most powerful men would be something else entirely. But for the first time in 15 years, Boone Mercer felt like he was fighting for something that mattered. And that feeling was better than any medicine Thomas carried in his old leather bag. By afternoon, Belle was on her feet and drinking water on her own. The pups still moved slowly, but their eyes were brighter, and they'd managed to nurse a little. Thomas declared it a minor miracle, though he warned the recovery would take days. Maybe weeks. They didn't have weeks. Riders coming up the South Trail, Boone said, peering through a crack in the cabin's shuttered window. 3 of them, moving slow like they're tracking. Thomas gathered his medical supplies while Boone checked his weapons. The Winchester was loaded, and he had a full cylinder in the Colt. Enough for 6 men if it came to shooting, but he'd rather avoid a fight with the dogs still weak. There's a root cellar behind the cabin, Thomas said. Hidden entrance under the woodpile. Dogs could hide there while we lead these fellows on a chase. I'm not leaving them defenseless. You're not leaving them. I am. Thomas picked up Belle gently, and she didn't protest. Take my horse and ride hard for Devil's Canyon. Make enough noise that they follow you. I'll stay hidden with the dogs until you circle back. It was a good plan, but something about it bothered Boone. Why would you risk yourself for animals that aren't even yours? Thomas paused in the doorway, Belle cradled in his arms. Because 30 years ago, I took an oath to do no harm and to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Never specified it had to be human. The old man disappeared into the cellar with the dog family, while Boone mounted Thomas's bay mare and rode out the back of the property. He made sure to break plenty of branches and leave. Clear tracks heading north toward the high country. The pursuing riders took the bait. Boone led them on a 2-hour chase, through rocky terrain where a horse could break a leg if pushed too hard. When he finally lost them in a maze of granite outcroppings, the sun was already sliding toward the western peaks. He circled back to find Thomas feeding the dogs small pieces of jerky soaked in clean water. All 4 animals were alert now, though still weak. The little black and white pup even managed a tail wag when Boone appeared. Search party give up? Thomas asked. For now. But they'll be back with more men tomorrow. Boone knelt beside Belle and scratched her ears. We can't keep running with sick animals. Eventually someone's going to get lucky. Then we don't run. We make our stand against Garrison's whole operation. He's got money, men, and influence with the territorial government. Thomas smiled, and there was steel in it. He's also got something we can use against him. Arrogance. That evening, they planned by firelight while the dogs slept peacefully for the first time since the poisoning. Thomas knew more about Garrison's operation than Boone had expected. The mine owner had been cutting corners for years, dumping waste directly into streams, ignoring safety protocols that cost money. Judge Caldwell isn't just hearing a water rights case, Thomas explained. He's investigating complaints about mining practices throughout the territory. Garrison's scared because if Caldwell finds evidence of deliberate pollution, it could shut down his whole operation. So he poisoned the judge's dogs to eliminate evidence. Worse than that, Mary Caldwell's been documenting water contamination for months, using her dogs as test subjects. They drank from different streams, and she tracked which ones made them sick. Thomas pulled a folded paper from his coat. This here's a copy of her notes, showing exactly which water sources are contaminated. Boone studied the document by firelight. Mrs. Caldwell's handwriting was precise, recording dates, locations, and symptoms with scientific accuracy. Belle and her pups had been drinking from Willow Creek for weeks, and the contamination levels had been steadily increasing. Where did you get this? Mary Caldwell's my cousin. She sent me a copy before those dogs disappeared. Said she was worried someone might try to destroy her research. Thomas refolded the paper carefully. With these notes and living dogs to confirm the symptoms, Judge Caldwell will have all the evidence he needs, assuming we can keep the dogs alive long enough for them to testify. Dogs don't testify in court, Mercer, but their blood does. Thomas held up a small glass vial filled with dark liquid. Took blood samples while they were unconscious. This will show exactly what kind of poison was used and when it was administered. Hope flickered in Boone's chest, but experience kept it in check. Garrison won't let this go to court. He'll try to stop us before the judge arrives. Then we better make sure we're ready for him. They spent the night taking turns on watch while the dogs recovered. Belle was strong enough to walk short distances, and the pups were nursing regularly. By dawn, Thomas declared them out of immediate danger. Though full recovery would take time, that's when the real trouble started. Smoke rising from town, Boone said, studying the southern horizon through his field glasses. Big fire, looks like. Thomas grabbed the glasses and peered toward Red Hollow. That's the courthouse burning. Son of a bitch is destroying evidence. They watched in grim silence as black smoke billowed into the morning sky. Garrison was making his move, eliminating anything that could connect him to the poisoned water. By the time Judge Caldwell arrived, there'd be no official records of contamination complaints. Still got Mrs. Caldwell's notes and the blood samples, Thomas said. But his voice lacked conviction. Will that be enough? Has to be. It's all we've got. Belle appeared at Boone's elbow, pressing against his leg like she understood the gravity of their situation. Looking down at her trusting eyes, he felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. These animals had become more than evidence. They'd become his responsibility, his reason for fighting. There's something else we need to consider, Boone said slowly. Even if we prove Garrison poisoned the dogs, what's to stop him from trying again? Or going after other people who oppose him? Thomas was quiet for a long moment. You thinking about strapping on that badge again? The question hung in the air like smoke from the distant fire. Boone had spent 15 years running from the law, from responsibility, from the weight of other people's lives in his hands. But sitting here with these rescued dogs, watching smoke rise from a courthouse fire, he realized that some things were worth fighting for. Maybe, he said finally, maybe it's time somebody reminded Marcus Garrison that the law still means something in this territory. Belle looked up at him with those amber eyes, and in them he saw reflection of the man he used to be, the man he might still become if he had the courage to try again. Judge Caldwell arrived in Red Hollow 2 days ahead of schedule, riding into town just as the embers from the courthouse fire were still smoldering. From their hidden vantage point in the hills, Boone watched through his field glasses as a tall, distinguished man in a black coat surveyed the ruins with barely controlled fury. That's him, Thomas confirmed, and he looks about as happy as a rattler in a rainstorm. The judge was younger than Boone had expected, maybe 50, with silver threading through dark hair and the kind of bearing that commanded respect. Even from a distance, his anger was visible in every rigid line of his posture. Mrs. Caldwell with him? Boone asked. Can't tell from here. But if she is, and she sees what happened to the courthouse, a woman emerged from the stagecoach behind the judge, and even at this distance, her distress was obvious. She stood beside the smoking ruins, one hand pressed to her mouth, the other clutching a leather satchel to her chest. That's her, Thomas said quietly. And that satchel likely contains the only remaining copies of her research. They watched as Garrison approached the judge and his wife, his manner obsequious and concerned. Even without hearing the words, Boone could read the scene. Expressions of sympathy about the tragic accident, offers of hospitality, assurances that the hearing could proceed despite the unfortunate loss of records. We need to get down there, Boone said, before Garrison spins this whole thing in his favor. With what? 4 sick dogs and a vial of blood. Against Garrison's lawyers and bought witnesses? Boone lowered the field glasses, his jaw set with determination. With the truth. And with this, he pulled his old sheriff's badge from his saddlebag, the metal tarnished but still recognizable. He'd carried it for 15 years without pinning it on, a reminder of failure and lost purpose. Now it felt different in his hands, not like an anchor, but like a tool. You sure about this? Thomas asked. Once you pin that on, there's no going back to your mountain hideout. Maybe it's time I stopped hiding. Thomas studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. Well, if you're determined to walk into the lion's den, we better make sure those dogs are ready to roar. They loaded the recovering dog family into Thomas's wagon, cushioning them with blankets and making sure Belle could see her pups. The mother dog seemed to understand they were heading towards something important. Her ears stayed alert, and she kept looking between Boone and the town below. The ride down to Red Hollow felt like descending into a different world. Boone hadn't been among people in 15 years, and the sounds and smells of civilization hit him like a physical blow. Horses, smoke, cooking food, unwashed bodies, and underneath it all the sharp scent of fear. Word of their approach spread quickly. By the time they reached the town's main street, a crowd had gathered. Some folks looked curious, others hostile, but most just seemed afraid. Garrison's men were visible at strategic points, lounging outside the saloon, standing near the hotel, positioned where they could see everything. Judge Caldwell stood in front of what had been the courthouse steps, still talking with Garrison. When he saw the wagon approaching, his conversation stopped mid-sentence. "Judge Caldwell," Boone called out as he pulled the wagon to a halt. "I believe these belong to your wife." Mary Caldwell gasped when she saw Belle's head appear over the wagon's edge. The dog's tail began wagging weakly, and the woman rushed forward with tears streaming down her face. "Belle! Oh, my dear girl, where have you been?" She climbed into the wagon without regard for her dress, gathering her pets with gentle hands. "And the babies? They're all here, all alive." "Ma'am," Boone interrupted gently, "your dogs have been poisoned, deliberately. We've been treating them, but they're still weak." Judge Caldwell's expression went from relief to fury in the space of a heartbeat. "Poisoned? By whom?" Garrison stepped forward, his face a mask of concern. "Now, Judge, I'm sure there's an explanation." "The explanation," Thomas said, climbing down from the wagon, "is that someone tried to destroy evidence of water contamination by killing the animals Mrs. Caldwell was using to document pollution levels." "And you are?" "Dr. Thomas Byrne, veterinary surgeon. I have blood samples proving these animals ingested arsenic over an extended period." Thomas held up the glass vial. "The same arsenic that's been leaching into Willow Creek from mining operations upstream." The crowd murmured, but Garrison's voice cut through the noise. "Judge, these are serious accusations being made by men I don't recognize. This fellow claims to be a veterinarian, but he's nothing but an old prospector. And this other one, Boone said, pinning the star to his vest, is Sheriff Boone Mercer. And I'm placing you under arrest, Marcus Garrison, for attempted murder of animals, destruction of evidence, and conspiracy to defraud the territorial government." The silence that followed was deafening. Then the whispers started. Old-timers who remembered Sheriff Mercer, younger folks who'd heard the stories, everyone trying to process the return of a legend. Garrison laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Sheriff Mercer? The man who abandoned his post and disappeared into the mountains?" "I don't think so." He gestured to his men. "This is clearly an imposter trying to disrupt legitimate proceedings. The badge is real," Judge Caldwell said quietly, studying Boone's face. "And I remember the name. But Sheriff Mercer's jurisdiction ended 15 years ago when he resigned his commission." "That's where you're wrong, Your Honor." Thomas pulled another document from his coat. Territorial Statute 247 states that a sheriff's commission remains valid until officially revoked by territorial authority or death. Since Mercer never formally resigned, just stopped wearing the badge, he's still technically the law in this county. Boone felt every eye in the crowd on him, measuring, judging, remembering. Some of these people had been here when he left, had seen him pin that same badge to the desk and walk away. Now they watched him claim it back, and the weight of their expectations was heavier than any mountain pack. "Even so," Garrison said, his confidence wavering slightly, "what evidence does he have?" "The word of a sick old prospector and some dying dogs." Mary Caldwell stood up in the wagon, her voice carrying clearly across the square. "The evidence, Mr. Garrison, is right here." She held up her leather satchel. "Months of documentation proving that water from sources near your mine contains lethal levels of arsenic. My dogs were drinking that water as test subjects, and you tried to murder them to hide your crimes. Now see here. No, you see here. Judge Caldwell's voice carried the authority of territorial law. Mrs. Caldwell's research will be entered as evidence in tomorrow's hearing. Sheriff Mercer's charges will be investigated. And if I find that courthouse fire was anything other than an accident, a shot rang out from the direction of the saloon. The bullet whined past Judge Caldwell's head and splintered the wagon's side rail, sending Belle and her pups scrambling for cover. Boone's Colt was in his hand before the echo faded, his body moving with reflexes honed by decades of violence. "Everyone down!" he shouted, scanning the buildings for the shooter's position. The crowd scattered like leaves before a storm, folks diving behind water troughs and scrambling into doorways. Garrison's men were drawing their weapons, but whether to help or hinder wasn't immediately clear. Another shot cracked from the saloon's second-floor window. This one caught one of Garrison's hired guns in the shoulder, spinning him around like a child's top. That answered the question about whose side the shooter was on. "Sniper in the saloon," Boone called to Thomas, who was shielding Mary Caldwell and the dogs with his own body. "Keep them safe." Judge Caldwell had drawn a nickel-plated revolver from beneath his coat and was crouched behind a hitching post. "Sheriff, I count at least 3 men with rifles taking position around the square." Boone's mind shifted into the cold, calculating mode that had kept him alive through the war and years of frontier law enforcement. The saloon sniper had clear fields of fire down Main Street. Garrison's men were caught between protecting their boss and finding cover. The innocent townspeople were trapped in the middle. This wasn't random violence. It was planned. "Garrison," Boone called out, his voice carrying across the square. "Call off your dogs before someone gets killed." "They're not my men," Garrison shouted back from behind an overturned barrel. "Someone's trying to kill me too." A third shot proved him wrong, or at least partially wrong. This bullet took out a window inches from where Garrison crouched, showering him with glass but not drawing blood. Warning shots. Someone wanted them afraid, not dead. "Sheriff Mercer," a voice called from the saloon's upper window. "You remember me? Clem Briggs. We got ourselves a situation here that needs discussing." Boone's blood ran cold. Briggs was one of the 2 men who'd thrown the dogs off the bridge. But his voice carried none of the crude mockery from that morning. This was the tone of a man with nothing left to lose. "What do you want, Briggs?" "Want you to hear some truth before you go pinning murders on the wrong man." Another shot. This one aimed high enough to be clearly deliberate. "Mr. Garrison here ain't the only one with secrets." "Then come down and talk like a civilized man." "Can't do that, Sheriff. See, the moment I show my face in that square, someone's going to put a bullet in it. But maybe we can make a trade." Boone felt ice forming in his gut. "What kind of trade?" "Got someone up here you might want to see. Someone who's been looking for you for a long time." A woman's scream echoed from the saloon, high, desperate, and hauntingly familiar. Boone's knees nearly buckled as memories crashed over him like a flash flood. He knew that voice, had heard it in his dreams for 15 years. "Sarah," he whispered. "That's right, Sheriff. Dr. Sarah McKinnon, though she goes by a different name these days. Amazing how folks can survive things that everyone thinks killed them." The world tilted sideways. Sarah was dead, had been dead for 15 years. He'd seen the bodies at Willow Creek, seen what the Comancheros had done to the settlement. There'd been no survivors. "You're lying." "Am I? Why don't you ask her yourself?" There was a pause, then Sarah's voice, weak but unmistakable. "Boone, is that really you down there?" Judge Caldwell was staring at him with concern. "Sheriff, are you all right?" Boone forced himself to focus, to think like a lawman instead of a man whose world had just been turned upside down. If Sarah was alive, and that voice was either hers or the most convincing imitation he'd ever heard, then everything he'd believed about that night 15 years ago was wrong. "What do you want, Briggs?" "Want you to hear what really happened at Willow Creek. Want you to know why Dr. McKinnon here spent 15 years thinking you were dead too." Another pause. But we're gonna do this proper like. You come up here alone, unarmed, and I'll tell you everything. Then you can decide what justice looks like." "Don't do it," Thomas called from the wagon. "It's obviously a trap." "Maybe. But if there's even a chance—" "Boone." Sarah's voice again, stronger now. "He's telling the truth. About Willow Creek. About everything. But you have to know, I'm not the same person I was. What they did to us, what I've had to become to survive." Her voice broke, and Boone felt 15 years of guilt and grief colliding in his chest like runaway trains. He'd failed to save her, had failed everyone at Willow Creek. That failure had driven him into the mountains, had made him abandon his badge and his duty. But if she was alive— "I'm coming up," he called. "Boone, no!" Mary Caldwell's voice cut through his thoughts. "Think about what you're doing. Those dogs need you. This town needs you. Don't throw that away for— "For what? For the woman I should have saved 15 years ago?" Boone began unbuckling his gun belt. "Ma'am, I've been carrying that failure every day since. If there's a chance to make it right, by getting yourself killed—" Judge Caldwell stood up slowly, his weapon still drawn. "Sheriff Mercer, as a representative of territorial law, I'm ordering you not to enter that building. We don't negotiate with kidnappers and murderers. With respect, Your Honor, this isn't about territorial law. This is personal." Boone dropped his gun belt and started walking toward the saloon, his hands visible and empty. Behind him, he heard Thomas cursing and Mary Caldwell calling his name. But all he could focus on was the possibility that the woman he'd loved, the woman whose death had destroyed his faith in himself, might somehow still be alive. "Boone," Thomas called after him, "what about the dogs? What about justice for what?" "Garrison did." Boone paused at the saloon's bat-wing doors, looking back at the wagon, where Belle watched him with those trusting amber eyes. The dogs seemed to understand that he was walking away from them, possibly forever. "Take care of them," he said, "and if I don't come back out, make sure the judge hears the whole truth." Then he pushed through the doors into the darkness beyond, leaving behind the badge he'd just reclaimed and the animals he'd sworn to protect. The saloon's interior was dim and thick with the smell of old whiskey and fear. Boone's eyes adjusted slowly, taking in overturned tables and chairs scattered like broken bones across the floor. Sunlight slanted through bullet holes in the walls, creating dusty columns of light in the gloom. "Up here, Sheriff." Boone climbed the narrow staircase, each step creaking under his weight. At the top, a hallway stretched toward the back of the building, doors on either side standing open to reveal empty rooms. Only one door remained closed. "Last room," Briggs called. "And Sheriff, move real slow. I'm nervous, and nervous men make mistakes." Boone pushed open the door and stepped into a small room with a single window overlooking Main Street. Clem Briggs stood beside it, rifle in hand, but not immediately threatening. And there, sitting in a chair with her hands bound, but otherwise unharmed, was the woman who'd haunted his dreams for 15 years. Sarah McKinnon looked older, as they all did. Her dark hair was streaked with silver now, pulled back severely from a face marked by hardship and loss. But her green eyes were the same, and when they met his, he saw recognition and something else. Guilt. "Hello, Boone," she said quietly. "I wondered if I'd ever see you again." "Sarah." Her name came out as barely more than a whisper. "They told me you were dead." Everyone at Willow Creek was dead. Everyone was supposed to be dead. Briggs lowered his rifle but kept it ready. That was the plan. Kill everyone, burn the settlement, make it look like a Comanchero raid. Boone's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, then remembered he'd left it outside. "What plan? What are you talking about?" 15 years ago, your precious Dr. McKinnon here discovered something that certain powerful folks didn't want discovered. Something about water contamination from silver mining operations. Sound familiar? Pieces began clicking together in Boone's mind, forming a picture he didn't want to see. The same contamination we're dealing with now. Not the same, Sheriff, the exact same. Garrison's been poisoning water sources for decades, and 15 years ago, Dr. McKinnon had proof that would have shut him down permanently. Sarah's voice was steady, but filled with old pain. He was documenting illness patterns in livestock and wildlife, animals dying from arsenic poisoning, birth defects in cattle herds, fish kills in the streams. I had samples, photographs, testimonies from ranchers. So Garrison hired the Comancheros to kill you and destroy the evidence. Not Comancheros, Briggs said. Garrison's own men, dressed like Indians to cover their tracks. I was one of them. Boone felt the world shifting beneath his feet. You killed those people. I killed some of them. Won't lie about that. But when I saw what we were really doing, murdering women and children to protect some rich man's profits, I couldn't go through with it. So you saved Sarah. I tried to save everyone, failed with most of them, but I got her out. Told Garrison she died with the rest. Briggs gestured to Sarah with his rifle barrel. Except she didn't exactly stay grateful for the rescue. Sarah's laugh was bitter. Grateful? You want me to be grateful for watching my friends and patients butchered while you stood by with a smoking gun? I was trying to keep you alive. You were trying to keep yourself from feeling guilty. Sarah's composure cracked, revealing the rage beneath. Do you know what it's been like, living with the knowledge that I could have prevented those deaths if I'd just been stronger, smarter, less trusting? Boone sank into a nearby chair, overwhelmed by revelations that recontextualized his entire adult life. Where have you been all these years? Running, hiding, using different names and moving every few months because Garrison could never be sure I was really dead. Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper, watching from a distance while you blamed yourself for failing to save me. I should have been there. Yes, you should have. But not because it was your fault we were attacked. You should have been there because I asked you to come with me that night. Asked you to leave your precious badge behind for once and just be with me. The memory hit him like a physical blow. Their last conversation, the night before she'd left for Willow Creek. She'd wanted him to come with her, to spend a few days away from his duties as sheriff. He'd refused, said the town needed him more than she did. I was chasing horse thieves, he said weakly. You were choosing your badge over the woman who loved you. Again. Sarah's eyes blazed with 15 years of accumulated hurt. And when I died, when you thought I died, suddenly I became more important than any badge, any duty, any life you might have built. That's not, isn't it? You ran away, Boone. Abandoned everything and everyone who needed you because you couldn't live with the guilt. Well, congratulations. Your guilt was based on a lie. Briggs had been listening to this exchange with growing agitation. This is real touching and all, but we got bigger problems. Garrison knows she's alive now. Has known for years. Why do you think he's been so careful about expanding his operations? He's been waiting for her to die of old age. But she surfaced when the dogs got poisoned, Boone said, understanding beginning to dawn. When the same pattern started again, I couldn't let him do it again, Sarah said. Couldn't watch him poison animals to cover up human crimes. So I came back to Red Hollow to warn Judge Caldwell, but Garrison's men grabbed me yesterday. And that's where I come in, Briggs continued. Been working for Garrison all these years, but I got a conscience buried somewhere. When he ordered me and Morrison to kill the judge's wife and destroy her research, I finally said no. Morrison didn't say no. Morrison's been taking orders like a good soldier. But when I told him the truth about Willow Creek, about what we really did that night, Briggs shook his head. Man's got a daughter about the same age as some of those kids we killed. Didn't sit well with him. Where is Morrison now? Protecting the judge and your veterinarian friend. Making sure Garrison can't clean up this mess with more bullets. Boone stood slowly, his mind racing through possibilities and consequences. What do you want from me, Briggs? Why tell me all this now? Because tomorrow, that judge is going to decide whether Garrison gets to expand his operations. And because the only evidence that can stop him is sitting right here. Briggs nodded toward Sarah. She's got copies of all her research hidden away, plus 15 years of additional documentation of Garrison's crimes, evidence that will only matter if she lives to present it. Exactly. And Garrison knows where we are. His men are surrounding this building right now, waiting for full dark to make their move. Sarah looked between them with something like hope flickering in her eyes. Boone, I know you have no reason to trust me after what I've said. But those dogs you saved, they're not the first animals Garrison's tried to kill to hide his crimes. And they won't be the last unless we stop him. How many men does he have? 8, maybe 10. Plus whatever local guns he can buy with promises of quick money. Against 3 of us. 2, Sarah said quietly. I'm a doctor, not a gunfighter. I can patch wounds, but I can't prevent them. Boone walked to the window and looked down at the square. Thomas was still guarding the wagon with the dogs, while Judge Caldwell had taken cover behind the bank. Garrison was nowhere to be seen, which meant he was probably organizing his assault on the saloon. There's another way, Boone said finally. We don't fight them here. We take the fight to him. How? Boone smiled grimly as a plan began forming in his mind. With the one thing Garrison values more than his life, his mine, the plan was simple in concept, deadly in execution. Garrison's mine sat 3 miles up Copper Canyon, connected to town by a single wagon road that wound through narrow defiles perfect for ambush. More importantly, the mine's main shaft housed the pumping equipment that kept contaminated water from flooding the underground works. You destroy those pumps, Sarah explained as they prepared to leave the saloon. And the mine floods within hours. All that arsenic-laced water comes pouring out into Willow Creek, making the contamination impossible to hide, Boone finished. Even if we don't survive to testify, the evidence will be flowing right through the middle of town. Briggs checked his rifle one final time, assuming we can get there before Garrison's men storm this place. Morrison's buying us time, but not much. They'd waited for full dark before making their move. Outside, Garrison's hired guns had taken positions around the saloon, confident that their quarry was trapped. They hadn't counted on the building's connection to the adjoining general store through a shared cellar. Sarah moved through the darkness with surprising grace for someone who'd been tied up all day. 15 years of running and hiding had taught her skills that no medical school could provide. She led them through the store's back room and out into the alley where 3 horses waited. Morrison's work, Briggs explained quietly. Man knows how to plan an escape. The ride to the mine took them through terrain Boone knew intimately from his sheriff days. Every rock formation, every game trail, every place where an ambush could succeed or fail. The moon was dark, which helped conceal their movement, but made the rocky trail treacherous. Tell me about the pumps, he said to Sarah as they climbed higher into the mountains. Steam-powered, probably running on coal. The main equipment is housed in a brick building next to the shaft entrance. Destroy that, and the mine becomes uninhabitable within hours. And the workers, night shift is skeleton crew, maybe 6 men total, and they'll evacuate the moment flooding starts. Briggs pulled his horse alongside theirs. What about guards? Garrison's got to have security up there. 2 men at the gate, 1 roving patrol around the perimeter. But they're watching for claim jumpers and thieves, not 3 people with explosives. They'd stopped at an abandoned prospector's cabin on the way up, where Sarah had retrieved supplies she'd hidden months earlier. Dynamite, fuses, and primers, enough to bring down a mountain if used properly. Learned demolition work during the war, she'd explained when Boone questioned her expertise. Served as a field surgeon with Sherman's March. Sometimes you have to destroy things to save lives. Now, crouched on a ridge overlooking the mine, they studied their target through field glasses. The operation was larger than Boone had expected. Multiple shaft entrances, processing buildings, and a small army of equipment scattered across the mountainside. There, Sarah pointed to a substantial brick building near the main shaft.
Pump house.
Take that out and everything floods. Guards are where you said they'd be, Briggs confirmed. 2 at the gate, 1 making rounds every 15 minutes. What about escape routes? Back down the main road, or we can go up and over the ridge to Devil's Canyon. Either way, we'll be exposed once the shooting starts. Boone lowered his glasses and looked at his companions. In the starlight, Sarah's face showed the same determined expression he'd seen before she'd left for Willow Creek all those years ago. The expression that meant she'd made up her mind and wouldn't be swayed by arguments about safety or sanity. "There's still time to reconsider," he told her. "This doesn't have to be your fight anymore. It became my fight the moment Garrison ordered those people killed to hide his crimes. And it stayed my fight every day for 15 years while I lived like a ghost, afraid to use my real name or practice medicine openly. If we do this, there's no going back. Garrison will know you're alive, and he'll never stop hunting you." Sarah's smile was grim but determined. "Let him hunt. I'm tired of being the prey." They moved down toward the mine in stages, using shadows and equipment to mask their approach. The night shift workers were focused on their tasks, unaware that their employer's past was catching up with him. The first guard went down silently when Briggs took him from behind. They bound and gagged him, leaving him behind a pile of ore where he'd be safe when the flooding started. The second guard was more alert, forcing them to wait until his patrol route took him near a storage shed where Boone could grab him. "Two down, one to go," Briggs whispered as they approached the pump house. The roving guard's timing was off. He should have completed his circuit 5 minutes ago. That meant he'd either discovered one of his unconscious colleagues or changed his pattern, or he was waiting for them. "This feels wrong," Boone said, checking his Colt for the 10th time. "Too easy. Maybe Garrison didn't expect us to come here," Sarah suggested. But her voice lacked conviction. A rifle cracked from the darkness, and splinters exploded from the wooden crate beside Boone's head. More shots followed, coming from multiple directions. "Trap!" Briggs shouted, diving for cover behind a mining cart. They'd walked into a carefully planned ambush. Garrison's men had anticipated exactly this move and positioned themselves accordingly. Muzzle flashes lit up the night as bullets whined off metal and stone. "How many?" Boone called out. "At least 6, spread out in a semicircle. They've got us pinned against the pump house." Sarah crawled over to where Boone crouched behind an overturned wheelbarrow. "We need to get inside that building. Once we blow the pumps, they'll have bigger problems than shooting at us. How much time do you need to set the charges?" 5 minutes if everything goes perfect. 10 minutes more likely. Can't hold them that long in the open." A new voice cut through the gunfire. Marcus Garrison himself, calling from somewhere up the slope. "Mercer, I know you're down there. This doesn't have to end in bloodshed. Tell that to the folks you had murdered at Willow Creek." Boone shouted back. "Ancient history, Sheriff. What matters now is the future." "My future, this territory's future, and whether you live to see morning. What do you want, Garrison?" "Same thing I've always wanted. For people to mind their own business and let progress take its course. Walk away now, and I'll let you and your friends disappear. Stay, and you'll join the good people of Willow Creek." Sarah's eyes blazed with fury. "He's offering to let us run again, to spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders. I'm done running," Boone said, surprised by the certainty in his own voice. "And I'm done letting other people pay for my mistakes." He rose from cover and sprinted toward the pump house, drawing fire and giving Briggs and Sarah a chance to move. Bullets chased him across the open ground, but his old reflexes served him well. He rolled behind a steam engine just as shots peppered the metal where he'd been standing. "Nice try, Mercer," Garrison called. "But you're just delaying the inevitable. Sarah McKinnon dies tonight, along with her precious research. And tomorrow, Judge Caldwell will approve my expansion based on incomplete evidence. Not if the evidence comes flooding down the mountain." Sarah shouted back. She was already at the pump house door, working on the lock with tools from her medical bag. Boone provided covering fire while Briggs flanked left, trying to get a clear shot at their attackers. The lock clicked open and Sarah disappeared inside the brick building. Moments later, Boone heard the sound of machinery being torn apart, Sarah destroying the pumps by hand when subtlety failed. "She's in," he called to Briggs. "How long can we hold them?" "Long as we have ammunition." That wasn't going to be long enough. Garrison's men were closing the circle, moving from cover to cover with military precision. Soon they'd be close enough that no amount of skill could overcome superior numbers. Then Boone heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the deep, thrumming roar of water under pressure finding its freedom. Sarah had succeeded in destroying the pumps, and now the mine was beginning to flood. Time to go. She called from the pump house doorway, but as they prepared to retreat up the mountain, torches appeared on the ridge above them. More of Garrison's men, cutting off their escape route. They were trapped between two forces with nowhere to run and a mountain of contaminated water building behind the failing mine works. Any other brilliant ideas? Briggs asked, reloading his rifle. Boone looked at Sarah, seeing in her face the same courage that had drawn him to her 20 years ago. Whatever happened next, at least they'd face it together. Just one, he said, pulling the last stick of dynamite from his belt. But you're not going to like it. Boone's plan was born of desperation and mountain instinct. The ridge above them wasn't solid rock. It was loose shale held together by scrub oak and hope. One well-placed explosion could bring down half the mountainside, creating chaos that might give them a fighting chance. You want to start an avalanche? Sarah stared at him like he'd lost his mind. We'll be buried along with everyone else. Not if we time it right. That loose rock will slide down the backside of the ridge, away from us. But it'll take Garrison's men with it, and if you're wrong, then we all die together instead of one at a time. Briggs was studying the slope through his field glasses. Might work. Shale's been undercut by winter runoff. Wouldn't take much to start a slide. Another volley of shots peppered their position, closer this time. Garrison's men were tightening the noose, confident in their numbers and superior position. Do it, Sarah said firmly. Whatever happens, it's better than letting Garrison win. Boone lit the fuse, with hands steadier than he had any right to expect. The dynamite arced through the night air, a flickering spark against the stars. For a moment that lasted forever, nothing happened. Then the mountain moved. The explosion itself was relatively small, a sharp crack that echoed off the canyon walls. But the chain reaction was magnificent and terrible. Tons of loose shale began to shift slowly at first, then with gathering momentum that sounded like thunder made of stone. Garrison's men on the ridge had perhaps 10 seconds to understand what was happening before the avalanche swept them away. Their shouts were lost in the roar of falling rock as the mountainside remade itself in seconds. "Move!" Boone shouted, grabbing Sarah's hand and pulling her toward the mine entrance. Before they regroup, the surviving members of Garrison's force were scattered and demoralized. Some had been caught in the edge of the slide, others were simply stunned by the sudden reversal of fortune. It would take them precious minutes to reorganize, minutes Boone intended to use. They fought their way back down the mountain as water began pouring from the mine shafts. What started as a trickle quickly became a torrent, carrying with it 15 years of accumulated poison. The contaminated water would reach Red Hollow within hours, providing undeniable evidence of Garrison's crimes. There, Briggs pointed toward the main road where torches approached at a gallop. "Cavalry's coming!" Judge Caldwell rode at the head of a dozen men, with Thomas and Morrison flanking him. Behind them came half the town, merchants, ranchers, and working men who'd finally heard enough about Marcus Garrison's version of progress. The judge pulled up beside them, his face grim with purpose. "Sheriff Mercer, I trust you have an explanation for this destruction?" "Yes, sir, evidence." Boone gestured toward the flooding mine. "All the evidence you'll need to shut down Garrison's operation permanently. And where is Mr. Garrison?" "Right here, Your Honor." They turned to see Marcus Garrison emerging from the shadows, flanked by the remnants of his hired army. His expensive suit was torn and dirty, his silver hair disheveled, but his eyes still burned with the fury of a man who refused to accept defeat. "This is terrorism, Judge Caldwell. These people have destroyed millions of dollars in private property based on wild accusations and circumstantial evidence. The evidence is flowing down the mountain as we speak," Sarah said, stepping into the torchlight. "Along with 15 years of documentation proving your systematic poisoning of water sources throughout this territory." Garrison's face went white when he recognized her. "You're supposed to be dead. So were a lot of people. But sometimes the dead come back to settle accounts. Judge Caldwell dismounted and approached Garrison with the slow, deliberate pace of justice delayed but not denied. Marcus Garrison, you are under arrest for conspiracy, murder, environmental destruction, and corruption of territorial resources. You can't prove any of that. Actually, I can. Thomas stepped forward with a leather portfolio. Mrs. Caldwell's research, Dr. McKinnon's documentation, blood samples from the poisoned animals, and testimony from Mr. Morrison about the Willow Creek massacre. I'd say that constitutes adequate proof. Morrison nodded grimly. Told them everything, Mr. Garrison, about Willow Creek, about the dogs, about all of it. Figure it's time to pay for what we done. Garrison's composure finally cracked. You fools! You have no idea what forces you're opposing. I have connections in the territorial capital, friends in Washington. This won't end here. Maybe not, Boone said, pinning his badge more securely to his vest. But it starts here. As they bound Garrison's hands and loaded him into a wagon, the contaminated water continued its inexorable journey toward Red Hollow. By morning, the whole territory would see the evidence of his crimes flowing through their streets. Dawn broke over Red Hollow to reveal the price of truth. Arsenic-laced water flowed down Main Street in a poisonous river that stained everything it touched the color of old blood. The townspeople stood on higher ground, watching their community become evidence in the territory's most important environmental case. Belle and her pups were the first to greet Boone when he rode back into town. The mother dog had recovered enough strength to walk, and her tail wagged furiously as she pressed against his legs. The pups tumbled around his boots, healthy enough now to play despite their ordeal. Look at them, Mary Caldwell said, kneeling to embrace her recovered pets. You wouldn't know they'd been at death's door just days ago. Judge Caldwell was less sentimental, but equally satisfied. He stood in front of the ruins of the courthouse, surveying the contaminated water with the eye of a man who'd finally found the evidence he'd been seeking for months. This will shut down every mining operation in the territory until they can prove their methods are safe, he announced to the assembled crowd. No more poisoned streams, no more dead livestock, no more children getting sick from contaminated water. The crowd's cheers were subdued by the reality of what they were seeing. Red Hollow would recover from this flood, but the scars would remain for years. Still, it was better than the alternative, letting Garrison's crimes continue unchecked. What happens to Garrison now? Thomas asked. Federal prison if justice prevails. His crimes cross territorial boundaries, which makes this a federal case. Judge Caldwell's expression was grim but satisfied. The territorial governor will appoint a special prosecutor to handle the investigation. Boone found himself standing apart from the crowd, watching the contaminated water flow past with mixed emotions. Justice was being served, but at a cost that would be felt for generations. The mountain country he'd loved and protected for 15 years was scarred by the battle. Sarah approached quietly, her medical bag in one hand and a leather portfolio in the other, having second thoughts. Just thinking about the price of doing what's right. The price of not doing it would have been higher. She gestured toward Belle and her pups. Those dogs would be dead. More animals would be poisoned. More people would suffer while Garrison expanded his operations. And more settlements like Willow Creek would disappear when they got in his way. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher over the mountains. 15 years of separation and misunderstanding couldn't be erased in a single night, but understanding had begun. What will you do now? Boone asked. What I should have done years ago. Practice medicine openly, using my real name, without fear. Sarah's voice was quiet but determined. Judge Caldwell has offered me a position as territorial health inspector, documenting environmental crimes throughout the region. Important work. Necessary work. Someone has to speak for those who can't speak for themselves, the animals. The land, the people too poor or scared to fight men like Garrison. Boone nodded, understanding the weight of such responsibility. He'd carried similar burdens during his sheriff days, before grief and guilt had driven him into exile. And you? Sarah asked. Will you keep the badge this time? That was the question he'd been avoiding all morning. Red Hollow needed a sheriff, especially with the long process of rebuilding ahead. But wearing a badge meant accepting responsibility for other people's lives, and the last time he'd done that— "The dogs trust you," Sarah said quietly. "Belle follows you around like you're her partner, not her rescuer. And the townspeople, they're looking to you for leadership through this crisis. I failed them before. You failed yourself." "There's a difference." Sarah's hand touched his arm briefly. "Boone, you saved those dogs because you couldn't stand to see innocent creatures suffer. That same instinct made you a good sheriff 15 years ago, before I let my pride and stubbornness cost lives, before you learned that being human means making mistakes and living with the consequences." Sarah's green eyes held his steadily. "The question isn't whether you'll fail again. You will. The question is whether you'll let that possibility paralyze you." Morrison appeared at Boone's shoulder, his hat in his hands, and guilt written across his weathered face. "Sheriff, got something that belongs to you." He held out a battered leather holster and gun belt, Boone's original equipment from his sheriff days. "Somehow preserved through 15 years of chaos and change. Found it in Garrison's office," Morrison explained. "He kept it as a trophy, I guess. Proof that he'd driven you away." Boone took the gun belt, feeling its familiar weight. The leather was scarred but still strong, like the man who'd worn it. "Figured you might want it back," Morrison said. "Seeing as how you'll need proper equipment for the job ahead." Belle appeared beside them, her amber eyes intelligent and trusting. One of her pups, the little black and white female, sat beside Boone's boot and looked up at him expectantly. The choice was made without conscious thought. Boone buckled on the gun belt and adjusted the badge on his vest. 3 months later, the last of the contaminated water had been cleaned from Red Hollow's streets. But the changes it brought would last forever. The town had a new courthouse, built with funds seized from Garrison's illegal mining profits. More importantly, it had new laws protecting water sources throughout the territory. Boone walked his morning patrol with Belle at his side, the mother dog having appointed herself his unofficial deputy. Her pups had grown strong and playful, living with Mary Caldwell, but spending their days exploring the town under Belle's watchful protection. The badge on his chest felt natural now, not like a burden, but like a tool he'd finally learned to use properly. There had been challenges, a claimed jumping dispute near Devil's Canyon, some cattle rustlers who thought the new sheriff might be soft, but nothing that couldn't be handled with patience, wisdom, and the occasional display of mountain-honed reflexes. "Sheriff!" A young voice called from the schoolhouse steps. Boone turned to see Tommy Henderson, the blacksmith's son, running toward him with excitement bright in his 8-year-old eyes. "What is it, Tommy?" "Dr. McKinnon says to tell you the water samples came back clean. All of them. Willow Creek, Copper Canyon, even the old mining pools up north." The news brought a smile to Boone's weathered face. Sarah had spent the past 3 months documenting water quality throughout the territory, working with federal inspectors to ensure Garrison's contamination was fully contained. Clean water meant safe communities, healthy livestock, and a future where children could drink from mountain streams without fear. "You tell Dr. McKinnon. That's fine news indeed," Boone replied. Ruffling the boy's hair, Tommy ran off with the boundless energy of childhood, and Boone continued his patrol. Red Hollow was growing again, new families arriving each week, drawn by stories of a town where justice still meant something, and the law protected those who couldn't protect themselves. At the edge of town, he found Thomas Byrne working in his new veterinary clinic. The old prospector had traded his pickaxe for medical instruments, establishing the territory's first practice dedicated exclusively to animal care. "Morning, Doc," Boone called. "How are the patients today?" "Healthy as horses, which is appropriate since most of them are horses." Thomas looked up from bandaging a foal's injured leg. "Got a telegram from the territorial capital yesterday. Garrison's trial date is set for next month. Think it'll stick?" With Morrison's testimony, Sarah's documentation, and half the territory's water sources as evidence, he'll be lucky to avoid the gallows. They'd learned more about Garrison's crimes in the months since his arrest. The Willow Creek massacre was just the beginning, a pattern of violence and corruption that stretched back decades and reached into the highest levels of territorial government. The investigation had already resulted in 3 resignations and 2 more arrests. Justice delayed, but not denied, Boone said. Speaking of which, heard from Sarah lately? Boone nodded toward the mountains, where a familiar figure could be seen riding down the main trail. Sarah had spent the past week in the high country, documenting the recovery of wildlife populations in areas where clean water was returning. She looked different now than she had 3 months ago, healthier, more at peace with herself and the world. The shadow of 15 years spent running and hiding had lifted, replaced by the confidence of a woman doing meaningful work in her own name. "Find anything interesting up there?" Boone asked as she dismounted in front of Thomas's clinic. A family of otters in Copper Creek, first ones seen there in 20 years. Sarah's smile was radiant. "The land heals faster than we expected when we stop poisoning it." They walked together toward the center of town, Belle trotting alongside with her tail wagging. The late afternoon sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, and somewhere in the distance a hawk cried as it rode the thermal currents above the canyon. "Any regrets?" Sarah asked quietly. Boone considered the question seriously. His mountain cabin sat empty now, his hermit years truly behind him. The solitude he'd thought necessary for survival had been replaced by community, responsibility, and the daily challenge of serving something larger than his own guilt. "None worth mentioning," he said finally. "What about you?" "I regret the years we lost, but not the choices that led us here." They paused in front of the new courthouse, where a bronze plaque commemorated the events that had changed Red Hollow forever. It read simply, "In memory of those lost at Willow Creek, and in honor of those who ensured their sacrifice was not in vain." Below the inscription, someone had carved a smaller note: "Justice delayed is justice denied. But justice served heals all wounds. You think that's true?" Sarah asked, reading the inscription. "I think justice is like water. It finds a way eventually. Sometimes it takes 15 years and a few good dogs to show us the path." Belle looked up at them with those intelligent amber eyes, and Boone could swear she understood every word. She'd saved them as much as they'd saved her, pulling them back into a world where caring about others was a strength, not a weakness, as the sun set over Red Hollow, casting long shadows across the clean streets. Sheriff Boone Mercer walked his evening patrol, with his deputy dog beside him. Behind them, Dr. Sarah McKinnon prepared for another day of healing the land and its creatures. The mountain man had found his way home at last, and Justice had returned to Red Hollow wearing a badge, carrying hope, and following the wisdom of a mother dog who'd never stopped believing in the goodness of human hearts.